Hey crew, good to see you again. Okay, here's what we're going to do. We're going to keep going on Mr. Popper's Penguins. We're on chapter 12. Chapter 12 is called More Mouths to Feed. If you remember where we're at, Mr. Popper now has Captain Cook, the original penguin that he got from Admiral Drake, and now he has Greta, that they call her, that they got from another aquarium institute kind of place. And Greta is there to help Captain Cook not feel so lonely, and they're hoping it'll work out. And guess what? It is so far, because we found out that the family has decided they're going to let the house be open for the winter, and snow has come in, and it's cold, and it's going to be amazing. But Mr. Popper has a plan so that the family can still live in the house as well, because Mrs. Popper is not quite sure how she feels about all this right now. But let's go ahead and let's read Chapter 12, More Mouths to Feed. So the next day, Mr. Popper called an engineer and had a large freezing plant installed in the cellar, and took Captain Cook and Greta down there to live. Then he had the furnace taken out, moved upstairs in the living room, and it looked very odd there, but as Mrs. Popper said, it was a relief not to have to wear their overcoats all the time. Mr. Popper was quite worried when he found that all these changes were going to be very expensive. The refrigerator engineer was worried too when he found out that Mr. Popper had practically no money. However, Mr. Popper promised to pay as soon as he could, and the man let him have everything on credit. It was a good thing that Mr. Popper got the penguins moved when he did, because Mrs. Popper had been right about the eggs. The rookery, that's a penguin's nest, the rookery had scarcely been moved to the basement when Greta laid the first egg. 3 days later, the second one appeared. Since Mr. Popper knew that penguins lay only 2 eggs a season, he was astonished when, a little later, the third egg was found under Greta. Whether the change in climate had changed the penguins' breeding habits, Mr. Popper never knew. But every third day, a new one would appear until there were 10 eggs in all. Now, penguin eggs are so large that the mother can sit on only 2 at a time, and this created quite a problem. Mr. Popper solved it, however, by distributing the extra eggs under hot water bottles and electric heating pads, just kept at a penguin body heat. The penguin chicks, when they began to hatch, were not so handsomely marked as their mother and father. They were fuzzy, droll little creatures who grew at a tremendous rate. Captain Cook and Greta were kept very busy bringing food to them, though, of course, the Poppers all helped too. Mr. Popper, who had always been such a great reader, had no difficulty in thinking of names for the penguin children. They were Nelson, Columbus, Louisa, Jenny, Scott, Magellan, Adelina, Isabella, Ferdinand, and Victoria. Still, he was rather relieved that there were no more than 10 to name. Mrs. Popper, too, thought that this was about enough penguins for anybody, though they really did not make much difference to her in her housework, as long as Mr. Popper and the children remembered to close the cellar door in the kitchen. The penguins all loved to climb the stairs that led up to the kitchen, and never knew when to stop unless they found the kitchen door closed. Then, of course, they would turn around and toboggan down the steps again. This made a rather curious noise sometimes, but when Mrs. Popper was working in the kitchen, she got used to it, as she had got used to so many other strange things this winter. The freezing plant that Mr. Popper had got for the penguins downstairs was a large and good one. It made very large blocks of ice instead of small ice cubes, so that soon Mr. Popper had made a sort of ice castle down there for the 12 penguins to live in and climb over. Mr. Popper also dug a large hole in the cellar floor and made a swimming and diving pool for the birds. From time to time, he would throw live fish in the pool for the penguins to dive for. They found this very refreshing because, to tell the truth, they had got a little tired of canned shrimp. The live fish were especially ordered and were brought all the way from the coast in tank cars and glass boxes to 432 Proudfoot Avenue. Unfortunately, they were quite expensive. It was nice that there were so many penguins, because when 2 of them, usually Nelson and Columbus, got into a fight and began to spar at each other with their flippers, the other 10 penguins would all crowd around to watch the fight and make encouraging remarks. This made a very interesting little scene. Mr. Popper also flooded a part of the cellar floor for an ice rink, and here the penguins often drilled like sort of small army, in fantastic marching movements and parades around the ice. The penguin Louisa seemed especially fond of leading these marching drills. It was quite a sight to see them. After Mr. Popper had the idea of training Louisa to hold a small American flag in her beak while she proudly led the solemn parades. Janie and Bill would often bring their little friends home from school with them, and they would all go down and watch the penguins for hours. At night, instead of sitting and reading and smoking his pipe in the living room, as he had done before, Mr. Popper would put on his overcoat and take his things downstairs. There he would sit and read with his mittens on, looking up from time to time to see what his pets were doing. He often thought about the cold, distant regions in which the little creatures really belonged. Often, too, he thought of how different his life had been before the penguins had come to keep him occupied. It was January now, and already he dreaded to think of the time when spring would come, and he would have to leave them all day and go back to painting houses. Chapter 13, Money Worries. There came a night, however, when Mrs. Popper, having put the children to bed, stopped Mr. Popper on his way to the cellar. "Papa," she said, "I must talk to you. Come and sit down." "Yes, my love," said Mr. Popper. "What is on your mind?" "Papa," said Mrs. Popper, "I'm glad to see you having such a nice vacation, and I must say that it's been easier than usual to keep the place tidy with you down in the basement all the time. But, Papa, what are we to do for money?" "What is the trouble?" asked Mr. Popper. "Well, of course the penguins have to eat, but have you any idea what the bills for all those live fish are? I'm sure I don't know how we're ever going to pay for them. And the engineer who put in the basement freezing plant keeps ringing the doorbell and asking for his money." "Is our money all gone?" asked Mr. Popper quietly. "Well, practically all. Of course, when it is all gone, maybe we could eat the 12 penguins for a while." "Oh, no, Mama," said Mr. Popper. "You don't mean that." "Well, I don't suppose I really could enjoy eating them, especially Greta and Isabella," said Mrs. Popper. "Oh, it would break the children's hearts too," said Mr. Popper. He sat there thoughtfully for quite a while. "I have an idea, Mama," he said at last. "Maybe we could sell them to somebody and then we would have a little money to live on," said Mrs. Popper. "No," said Mr. Popper. "I have a better idea. We will keep the penguins. Mama, you have heard of trained seals acting in theaters." "Well, of course I have heard of trained seals," answered Mrs. Popper. "I even saw some once. They balance balls on the end of their noses." "Well, very well then," said Mr. Popper. "If there can be trained dogs and trained seals, why can't there be trained penguins?" "Perhaps you are right, Papa." "Of course I am right. And you can help me train the penguins." The next day, they had the piano moved down into the basement at one end of the ice rink. Mrs. Popper had not played the piano since she had married Mr. Popper, but with a little practice, she soon began to remember some of the pieces she had forgotten. "What these penguins like to do most," said Mr. Popper, "is to drill like an army, to watch Nelson and Columba get in a fight with each other, and to climb up steps and toboggan down. And so we will build our act around those tricks." "Well, they don't need costumes anyway," said Mrs. Popper, looking at the droll little figures. "They already have a costume." So Mrs. Popper picked out 3 different tunes to play on the basement piano, one for each kind of act. Soon the penguins knew from hearing the music just what they were to do. When they were supposed to pray like a lot of soldiers, Mrs. Popper played Schubert's Military March. When Nelson and Columbus were to fight each other with their flippers, Mrs. Popper played the Merry Widow Waltz. And when the penguins were supposed to climb in toboggan, Janie and Bill would drag out into the middle of the ice 2 portable stepladders and a board that Mr. Popper had used when he was decorating houses. Then Mrs. Popper would play a pretty descriptive piece called By the Brook. It was cold in the cellar, of course, so that Mrs. Popper had to learn the piano with her gloves on. By the end of January, Mr. Popper was sure the penguins were ready to appear in any theater in the country. Now, a penguin act is what they're going to plan to do to make some money. Now, we don't see this too much anymore, except for usually around this time of the year, we start talking about the circus coming to town, right? And in the circus, they have things like elephants and tigers and lions and dogs and monkeys and clowns and all that kind of stuff. Well, that's a circus. But what the train acts they're talking about are, in different towns, there would be theaters. In fact, in Aberdeen, we have what's called the Capitol Theater. And if you ever go to the Capitol Theater, they show movies up there, but there's also a large stage up there, bigger than the stage in our gym at school. And sometimes towns like Aberdeen, where you're out in the middle of, South Dakota, where you don't get a lot of things, they would have people bring in acts. And it might be magicians, it might be ventriloquists, it might be singers, ooh, stuff like this. But the other thing they would do is they would bring in animal acts to be on these stages because people didn't get to see things like seals and penguins and trained dogs doing different fun acts and stuff like that. And so you might have those acts come into Aberdeen, perform at the Capitol Theater downtown, and people would pay money to see them. That's what Mr. Popper's plan is. And if you notice, he said there are trained seals and trained other things. Why not train penguins? I think I would go and pay and watch them train penguins because something you don't get to see every day. And especially in 1938 when this is taking place and you don't have TV where you can watch shows like America's Got Talent or things like that, this is your form of entertainment. Somebody bringing something to you. Disney Plus, I can watch shows like National Geographic shows where they show me animals in the wild. Didn't have that in 1938. So this is actually might be a good idea. They just have to have somebody who's willing to hire them to be in their theater and people would come out to watch. So that's the plan to make some money. Because right now they have a lot of bills to pay and not enough money. Remember, Mr. Popper doesn't do his painting during the winter months, and they were already worried about money. Now they've made a lot of extra expenses. So we'll see how this works. Next chapter is called Mr. Greenbaum, and we'll see who Mr. Greenbaum is tomorrow. Catch you later.